When Dion Abdul called and asked me to speak today, he didn't tell me what the theme of the conference was. And I was remiss not to ask. I simply assumed that I would make my usual entreaties on transparency and accountability, which would fall on the usual deaf official airs. But when I received his written invitation and actually saw the theme, I immediately got worried. At such moments of linguistic stress, I normally fall back on my dictionary or my thesaurus for solace, and not much was forthcoming on this occasion. One of the definitions of the word culture was given as, quote, the attitudes and behavior characteristic of a particular social group, unquote. But as we all know, corruption involves all social groups. It is pervasive. It is a barrier to progress. And the phrase break free suggests a sudden, mighty, successful effort to escape confinement or control by someone or something. But how exactly do you break free from an affliction that is pervasive, not to say entrenched? In Trinidad and Tobago, we have for decades been wringing our hands over corruption. For instance, the PNM, when it first presented itself for political office in 1956, ran on a platform of, among other things, morality in public affairs. And one of the fundamental principles of the People's Charter it placed before Trinidad and Tobago in January that year was, quote, eradication of graft, corruption, and dishonesty from public life, unquote. More than 60 years later, we have eradicated none of those things. If anything, they have proliferated. Yet side by side with this expansion, we saw a poll earlier this month in Trinidad and Tobago, reflective of similar polls in the past, indicating that a substantial majority of the population remained extremely concerned about corruption. How do you explain this apparent contradiction? How exactly do we in this country understand the word corruption? Are we more concerned with the amount involved in the reported misdeed than with the principle of the misdeed? It's not only the PNM that has been publicly striking an anti-corruption stance, which the Prime Minister has recently repeated. Not to be outdone, the People's Partnership, during whose 2010-2015 term in office corruption is alleged to have exponentially increased, said in its 2015 general election manifesto that it was, quote, constructively addressing the issue of corruption, unquote, and promised a significant improvement in the perception of corruption in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, both the PNM and the PP, and intervening governments as well, have solemnly stressed their commitment to campaign finance reform. While in 2015, the PNM certainly undertook to, quote, introduce as a priority whistleblower protection legislation to allow exposure of corrupt activities, unquote. Where is that legislation now? I think the Attorney General said it's going to come back to Parliament. And is the political investocracy not alive and in excellent health? 60 years of largely unfulfilled pledges, ladies and gentlemen. 60 years. How do you break free from such a culture of political promise and inaction, not to say cynicism? When legislation is not put in place, or if put, is not fully proclaimed, like the badly needed Procurement Act, or not proclaimed at all. In this matter of corruption, I think we are too prone to generalize. Yes, corruption affects all groups and countries, but it seems to me that if we are to confront the scourge in a more positive way, we have to be more specific in how we go about what we say we want to achieve. For instance, shouldn't we first examine the nature of the society with which we have to deal so as to be in a better position to formulate and implement effective approaches to that society? Surely, it cannot be sensible to assume that what may work in Toronto or Helsinki or Oslo could always be applied wholesale to Port of Spain or Jakarta. The Canadian High Commissioner said earlier that she had never been exposed to corruption in her life. I wish I had that experience. I have been exposed many times to corruption in my life, and admittedly, I've lived longer than you. Does one size really fit all? And there aren't only country differences, most of them cultural in the wider sense of the word. There are also differences of physical size, and for an island country like ours, the great mental barrier of the sea. You can't drive from here to Roseau, or even to Scarborough. And there are differences of race and religion which influence outlook. If I may slightly misquote George Orwell, all the animals may seem equal, but some are more equal than others. Small physical size, as in the Caribbean, brings particular problems of perception and conduct. The same things may happen in the larger society, but there they are more easily handled, more easily subsumed in the whole. In the small society, they often, if not generally, assume dimensions out of all proportion to their intrinsic importance, and too often become obstacles to progress. Such institutions as exist not infrequently become the target of their very protectors. The guards besiege the citadels they have been commissioned to guard, as we have been seeing in this country. In the small society, we tend to concentrate on shadow, not on substance, on short-term pyrotechnics, not on long-term effort, on effect, not on cause. We make a virtue of proclaiming our rights with little or no reference to, let alone emphasis on, our responsibilities. A disturbingly high percentage of us are selfishly dismissive of others' misfortunes, though overall we have not lost our humaneness. Our professional dealings are often incestuous. Loyalty, personal and political, and the two are generally the same, is elevated above competence. Unsurprisingly, we seek to enhance our own material positions at the expense of those of the nation. Room at the top is sharply limited in the small society, and the boss makes it clear who is in charge, directing and instructing. Have you noticed how those two words are always used by people who are in charge? I direct that so-and-so, and I have instructed so-and-so. They never ask. Never. The top-down syndrome is to be found in every area. Massa or Mensahib Day is far from done. And victimization is often the fate of those who dare to be brave. We delight in pointing fingers at others, in adopting adversarial positions, in finding fault rather than solutions, and our propensity to rush to negative judgment without thought or evidence is second nature to us. I'll give you an example from my own experience with TTTI. As Dion Abdul has said, I was the person who 20 years ago brought Transparency International to Trinidad and Tobago. I first wrote the organization in 1995, during the late Patrick Manning's first term as Prime Minister. However, it was only in November 1997 the 3 TI representatives visited Trinidad and Tobago, and TTTI was launched in May of 1998, when Basdeo Pandey was the Prime Minister. To my astonishment, a letter appeared in the Express newspaper a few months later, affirming that, and I quote, "It is pretty obvious that TTTI was set up in 1998 specifically to support certain disgruntled persons and the party in opposition," then of course the PNM, "hopefully to embarrass and bring down the present government," unquote. The irony is that I had first written TI in 1995, when Patrick Manning and the PNM were in office. But perhaps I wanted to bring down his government as well. I suppose to start my own. I didn't realize I was that disgruntled. Cultural problems of small size are aggravated by economic underdevelopment or slowdown. White-collar crime is an unfortunate fact of life, whatever the country's level of development. But for those who are not so well off or who are downright poor, the need to exist when the country is in the doldrums becomes an omnipresent necessity. It is then, unfortunately, that the wealthy retreat into their well-appointed bunkers and make statements like the one we heard in a recent television program. This man said, and I quote, "At one time we used to have a huge middle class, which was a sort of security in terms of any conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. But now that's eroding because they're getting poorer, so they're starting to get angry," unquote. So in this deeply insensitive and societally dangerous view, the middle class, that's people like you and me, and presumably comprising racial and ethnic groups other than that of the speaker, the middle class acts as a convenient buffer between them and us. But now they are getting poorer and angrier. So troubles loom for us. And I would have thought for the middle class as well, since it's in between. What this classist interpretation did not, of course, mention is that, rightly or wrongly, they have been convinced for years that the privileged reached their positions not merely through hard work and thrift, but also and principally through bribery and corruption. And they are not impressed. But as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, and this will have to be explained to Dr. Labelle and others, if the priest could play, who is me? So they are themselves hardly the beacons of probity. They must better themselves, if I may proffer another misquotation, this time of Malcolm X, by all or nearly all means possible. TI has noted the link between social inequality and corruption. That in itself is not a total answer, because many of the rich and socially dominant, the ones who are more equal than most, are very corrupt indeed. I want to suggest that our focus should be less on inequality, however important that is, and much more on inequity. To my mind, it is the shortage, often the lack of equity, that is to say, of fairness and justice in the treatment of the ordinary man and woman, that helps undermine good governance, create divisions, and drive corruption. Classist proclamations of the type I just mentioned do nothing to conduce to social stability, the very stability that the proclaimers say they want. I'll try to give a snapshot of some of the more salient features of the small society, the problems inherent in and caused by small physical size, and by the very diversity of which many say they are so proud, by the psychological wall of the island mentality, by increasing burdens on the less well-off, by deepening and widening fissures among social classes, themselves more and more characterized by race and ethnicity, by the de-emphasis on equity as opposed to easy references to equality. There's no doubt more that I haven't said. Against that complex background, what action can be taken in Trinidad and Tobago, itself a small society, to confront positively the prevalence of corruption, even if, as was hoped in 1956, we cannot eradicate it? First, legislation. Some already exist in our books, but to what extent is it implemented and enforced? To what extent, as I asked earlier, is it even proclaimed? Why do people in this country always say that crooks here are never caught, or if caught, never punished? Second, school education. I and others have long criticized our education system, which puts too much emphasis on passing exams and on certification. But real education is much more than that, and among other things accentuates critical thinking and the values necessary for civilized existence. I note with pleasure that TTTI will be collaborating with the Integrity Commission and the National Parent-Teacher Association, the NPTA, on a project to be launched today, which aims at introducing integrity clubs in primary and secondary schools. I commend the principle, and I shall keep an eye on the practice. Third, the family. The number of single-parent households, mostly headed by women who in many, perhaps most cases, do not have regular employment, militates against quick success in this area. Here, the NPTA can assist, as well as the organization I was reading about recently, the name of which I forget, which has begun to provide guidance classes for single parents. Fourth, the private sector, many of whose members piously inveigh against corrupt activity while actively fostering it. I suggest that in the spreading of the anti-corruption message, an operational linkage be sought with a company like BP, which has strict and enforced ethical codes of conduct. I believe BP is still a corporate member of TTTI, and a start there should be painless. In the private sector category, I include our state enterprise system, described by Martin Daly 15 years ago as, quote, an important component of the cash register, unquote. Things have only got worse since, as we know. In an article 6 years ago, I called for root and branch reform of the system. Both Daly and I have been comprehensively ignored. Far from breaking free, the society finds itself squeezed even more by mushrooming octopus tentacles. Fifth, international organizations whose assistance should also be sought in a more ordered way. The UNDP, for instance, as we've heard, was extremely helpful in the preparation of the procurement legislation. Where the fight against corruption is concerned, what we should be doing, if we are at all serious, is formalizing that kind of international organization bond. We could think, for example, about the IMF, whose managing director, Christine Lagarde, was speaking about the evils of corruption just last week in Washington. Six, working together. I have just mentioned two bodies with which TTTI could work. There are others. While I am very aware of our national shortcomings, I remain an optimist. In the last few years, I have been greatly heartened by the growth of our middle ground, by which I mean those persons who are not unthinking votaries of this or that political party, and who increasingly take decisions after thought and analysis. Mind you, there is still a long, long way to go, but the process has begun, and it cannot now be halted. I recently came across an article on the question of working together. Speaking of Martin Luther King and Noam Chomsky, the article said that, quote, "Every voice for justice and human rights would agree that the people need to act instead of relying on movement leaders," unquote. And the article continued, quote, "Whatever actions one can take, whether it's engaging in informed debate with family, friends, or co-workers, writing letters, making donations to activists and organizations, documenting injustice, makes a difference. These are small individual actions that, when practiced diligently and coordinated together in the thousands, make every powerful social movement possible," unquote. Just yesterday, if I may say so in that context, I haven't said anything to Dion Abdul yet, but a friend of mine came up with a T-shirt he would like me to discuss. It's up to me to fight corruption. He's prepared to discuss it with the board, if it is interested, of course, of TTTI, and see whether this can't be spread throughout the country. The culture of corruption has been with the world for millennia. Just ask the ancient Romans, for example. We cannot break free from it just like that. But we can take steps considerably to reduce its presence and negative impact over time. To me, the most important step is the continuing involvement of the people, informed by education. We can do it, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we can. Now let's see if my words fall again on deaf ears. Thank you very much.